Dad gave my college fund to my brother's startup. I got the last laugh years later. Life often throws challenges at the most unexpected times. For a long time, everything seemed more or less stable in my family. I grew up with a clear understanding that I would go to college in the future. My parents always said they were saving money for my education, and I believed they would keep their word. My older brother was my father's favorite. He got all the best things: expensive trips, a new bike, freedom of choice. He could do whatever he wanted and always received approval. He was praised for anything, even the smallest achievements, while my efforts went unnoticed. But I was never jealous. I believed that everyone has their own path, and if I had to work harder to achieve something, it only made me stronger. I was 18 when the world around me suddenly turned upside down. In a few months I was to start studying at a prestigious university, and all this time I was calm because I knew I had financial support. But everything changed one day when I accidentally found out that my tuition fund no longer belonged to me. My father gave the money to my brother. Not for treatment, not to save from bankruptcy. No. Without warning, without discussion, he just made a decision that crossed out all my plans. The reason was simple: my brother needed startup capital for his business. My father believed that this was a more promising investment than my education. At that moment, I realized that I had never been a priority in this family. All my life, my father treated me as a backup, a child who would make it. He always praised my brother, always supported his ideas, always put him above me. But I tried to ignore it. But this time it was impossible to ignore the truth. It was not just an insult. It was a confirmation that I had never had real support. I felt like something broke inside me. There was no more room for doubts or naive hopes. I could no longer trust my father because he had proven that his decisions did not take my best interests into account. My mother was confused. She did not support this decision, but she could not change anything either. I could see that she was ashamed, that she felt guilty, but she never openly contradicted my father. She only tried to smooth things over, persuaded me to accept it, convinced me that in the future I would be able to find my own way to success. My father did not even consider it necessary to explain his decision to me personally. He was sure that I would just accept it and accept his choice. He believed that his views were the only right ones and that my plans did not matter. It was the moment when I realized that everything I had done before was irrelevant. I was someone who could be forgotten, someone whose dreams could be crossed out for the sake of someone more important. I sat in my room for a long time, trying to figure out what to do next. All options seemed unfair. I could just accept it, take out a loan and live with the realization that my family had betrayed me. I could argue, but I knew that it would not change my father's decision. But I also realized that this day was a turning point in my life. If I couldn't count on my family, I had to count on myself. I no longer had the right to be naive, no longer had the right to trust those who had already turned their backs on me once. I left the house without a plan, just walking down the street, trying to calm myself down. Everything inside me was raging: resentment, rage, disappointment. I thought about my brother, about how he was privileged again, how he got everything without even thinking that it was unfair. But most of all I thought about what I would do next. I will not let them ruin my life. I will not forget this day. I will no longer be someone who can be simply pushed to the background. This was only the first chapter. The story was just beginning. Life does not give you time to think when you find yourself in a desperate situation. The days after that conversation with my parents turned into a nightmare. I tried to convince myself that I could find a solution, that all was not lost, but the truth was inexorable: I was left without support. My plans to study at a prestigious university fell apart, and I had to find a way out quickly. Anger raged inside me. Not only at my father, but also at myself. Why did I believe that they really cared about me as much as they cared about my brother? Why didn't I see this before? But self-flagellation made no sense. I'm not the type to sit around and wait for pity. I had to act. The first option that came to mind was to find a job. But with a part-time job, it was almost impossible to cover the cost of my studies. I quickly realized that even if I worked around the clock, I would hardly be able to afford college without a loan. The second option was a loan. But the prospect of drowning in debt for years to come was frightening. I saw other students who couldn't find a decent job after graduation and spent decades paying off their loans. I didn't want to be one of them. I needed something more. I had to find a way to get ahead. Instead of despairing, I took action. I researched scholarships, financial aid programs, and looked for internship opportunities. I wrote dozens of applications, filled out questionnaires, and applied for grants. It was exhausting, but I didn't stop. At the same time, I was working. I took on any job I could find, serving food, working night shifts, doing freelance work. I hardly slept and felt tired all the time, but it was better than feeling hopeless. While I was fighting for my future, my brother was living as if he had won the lottery. He spent his father's money on his startup idea, boasted about the prospects, promised to revolutionize business. His father was proud of him. They spent time together, discussing plans and supporting each other. I was not a part of this family. I didn't try to be anymore. At some point I realized that I no longer felt pain because of their betrayal. The anger didn't disappear, but it turned into fuel. I no longer wanted their approval. I didn't want them to recognize their mistake. I wanted to prove to them that they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. My efforts paid off. I received a scholarship that covered a significant part of my tuition fees. The rest I earned on my own. It was hard, I lived on the verge of exhaustion, but I knew I was doing the right thing. The first year of college was a challenge. While most students were enjoying themselves, I was working almost around the clock. After classes, I ran to work, studied at night, and spent my weekends doing extra assignments. I rarely came home. Every visit was a reminder that I was no longer a part of their world. My father hardly spoke to me, my brother acted as if I were just a distant acquaintance. My mother sometimes tried to talk to me, but her words didn't matter. She couldn't protect me then, and it didn't change anything now. At the same time, I followed what was happening with my brother. His startup seemed promising at first, but gradually began to decline. He made classic mistakes, he spent more than he earned, ignored expert advice, and believed in quick success. I was not happy about his failures. But I saw that his path was different from mine. I went up through pain and difficulties. He was falling, not even realizing why. I was working on myself, acquiring skills, using every opportunity. And the more I grew, the more I realized that their decision did not break me. On the contrary, it made me stronger. I didn't need their support. I learned to live without them. And I already knew that the day would come when they would realize this. But that moment was still far away. I continued on my way, knowing that the real victory was yet to come. The distance between me and my family became not just physical, but also emotional. I stopped hoping that they would ever recognize their mistake. I didn't have time for that. Every day turned into a struggle for survival. I realized that if I wanted to succeed, I had to play the long game. I used every opportunity the university gave me. In between lectures, I took additional courses, studied everything that could be useful in the future. I did internships, wrote articles, worked with professors, and created projects that could attract the attention of large companies. When you know that there is no one behind you, you become cautious. You plan every step. You learn not to rely on chance. That is why I started working in my first year of study. First, part-time jobs, then small orders, then the first serious projects. My bank account didn't grow as fast as I wanted, but I didn't stop. While I was building the foundation of my future, my brother continued to spend other people's money. His startup looked promising only in words, but behind the scenes it was quite different. Money disappeared faster than it came in, the team changed, investors lost interest. He was used to support, used to his father always having his back, solving problems, finding new resources. I didn't follow him on purpose, but I heard rumors through my friends. People said that his business was on the verge of collapse. His friends, who had recently been praising his genius, began to withdraw. But that was not what struck me the most. I learned that my father had invested not only my fund, but almost all of his savings. He believed in his brother to the last. Even when it was already clear that everything was going downhill. My mother also tried to pretend that nothing was wrong. She constantly justified her brother, saying that there are difficulties in business and that everything can still be fixed. But there was nothing to fix. I was no longer a part of this family history. They had made their choice. My efforts began to bear fruit. I received an invitation to a prestigious internship. It was an opportunity that could change everything. I moved to another city, got my first serious experience, met people who could influence my career. The distance between me and my family became even greater. I hardly kept in touch with them, didn't come home for holidays, didn't respond to occasional messages from my mother. They were no longer a part of my life. But, strangely enough, it was at that moment that they remembered me. My father, who had been so proud of his brother, seemed to realize that he had not made the best choice. His voice, when we spoke on the phone by chance, did not sound as confident as before. He no longer praised his brother. Instead, he was silent. It was like he already knew what was going on. And I just kept moving forward. My progress was not rapid, but it was steady. I had no right to fail, so I worked harder than others. Meanwhile, everything was falling apart in my brother's life. The company my father had given all his money to failed. There was no business revolution. He spent almost everything he had received and was left with nothing. And then they decided to turn to me. As time passed, I realized that the real struggle begins only when you no longer expect anything from others. I became the person who no longer asked for support and did not hope for help. Instead, I was building my own road, which I paved myself. No matter how hard it was, I could only rely on myself. But my family did not leave me alone. Now that my brother had lost everything and my father had begun to realize the extent of his mistake, it seemed that they were trying more and more to turn to me as a savior. All those years, when I was floundering in the maelstrom of my problems, they tried to pretend that I didn't matter. Now everything has changed. They couldn't do without me anymore, and I could feel this change in my every move. The first signal was a call from my mother. She was so concerned that she didn't even try to hide her true intentions. It was not a normal, friendly question about how I was doing. It was a clear step towards getting me to help them. She was trying to hint that her father no longer knew what to do with his brother, and his business was now on the verge of bankruptcy. I heard the desperation in her voice, but I didn't respond to the hints. I no longer wanted to be a part of this dynamic. A few days later, I received a call from my father. His voice was weak. My father, who a few years ago believed that money and the right connections would solve all problems, now looked completely helpless. He seemed to know that any word I said could be decisive for whether they would be able to get out of this mess. "I know you've achieved a lot," he said, stumbling slightly. "Maybe you can help." I heard this request and felt my heart sink. This was not just a call to ask for money. No, they were not asking for money anymore. They were asking for support, asking to get back what they had lost. And not only materially, but also emotionally. They did not want to admit that they had made a mistake. They just wanted me to be the one who had all the answers again. I didn't answer right away because I didn't know what to say. It was hard for me. I wasn't interested in helping those who had betrayed me. But on the other hand, I realized that even my absence from their lives would have made them feel a loss. No matter what happened, they felt that their world no longer worked the way it used to. For 2 days I thought about whether to do it. My internal struggle was very strong. No matter how much I wanted to return to normal relations, I could not forgive what they had done. They had already squandered my future. Not only did they give away my foundation, but they also allowed my brother to spend their money on what they called a startup. All those ideas and hopes, all their assumptions that it would bring wealth, were naive and short-sighted. Now everything was ruined, and they were looking at me for the same solution they hadn't seen before. And so, on the 4th day after that call, I decided to act. But not in the way they expected. I knew that I couldn't just go back to their world and re-establish old ties. They would still not be able to respect me as they should. So I decided to create a situation in which they would realize that I was not the one who should have been underestimated. I decided to make them not only see my independence, but also realize that time was lost. I was going to make a real difference, not only financially but emotionally. I wrote an article that became popular in business circles and in my sector. I had been working on this idea for several months, and when the article came out, it attracted the attention of several large investors. It was not just an article, it was a concept that combined innovative technology and practical experience. It was an opportunity that not only validated my experience, but also put me in the spotlight. 2 weeks after that, they contacted me again, but this time it was different. They were no longer talking about help. They were trying to use my ideas as a kind of tool to solve their problems. My father asked if they could build a new business based on my ideas if they found the right partners. My brother, on the other hand, was more direct in his requests, offering me to join forces to revive their project. But I did not respond to these offers. I did not participate in their game. They were no longer important to me, because I realized that I was self-sufficient. At that moment, I didn't feel any resentment. I just knew that I was right. I could not be a part of this broken system. What happened next was a logical step for me. They could no longer manipulate me. They could no longer use my potential because I became self-sufficient and strong. Since I decided to stop helping my family, my life has changed significantly. I realized that true strength is not about saving those who betrayed you. True strength is about moving forward, no matter how many people leave you behind. And even if you were the one they once ignored or underestimated, you can still be at your best if you act for yourself and not for them. After I refused to help and they started calling me again in desperation, I felt that I could no longer compromise. My soul longed for freedom. I was not ready to sacrifice myself to gain their approval or love. There was no more room for their manipulations. Soon they realized that I had become self-sufficient and was at peace with what I had done. Gradually, my reputation in business grew. All those who once doubted me began to pay attention to my achievements. My ideas and practical solutions have been applied in many areas. I became famous, my articles and publications attracted attention, and it was no longer so important what my family thought. However, my life did not become easier. While I felt this inner victory, there were still questions on the horizon that I could not ignore. I thought about my brother and father. As hard as it was, I couldn't completely abandon this part of me that wanted to restore at least a minimal relationship with them. But I knew that I could no longer let them rule my life. I respected myself too much to fall back into the trap of their manipulation. We didn't speak for several years. There was an unbridgeable gap between us. They continued to look for ways to solve their problems, but without me, and I became an observer of this from the outside. I saw how my brother was trying to patch up his company, picking up partners and investors, but his ambitions could not stand the test of reality. He tried again, but he couldn't get back to the level we were at before. And my father, although he tried to get back into business, realized that his efforts were no longer working. He could not restore what had already been lost. All his attempts to pretend that everything was fine looked ridiculous. And then one day, when I was already at the top of my career, they came to me. They realized that they could no longer do without me, not because they began to see my value, but because they no longer had a choice. My father tried to explain that this time the situation was really serious, and he and my brother would no longer be able to restore the business without my help. I looked at them and realized that this situation was not only theirs, it was also my struggle. They came to me because they realized that I could help solve their problems, but most importantly, I was no longer dependent on them. I had become the person they wanted to have again, but could no longer hold on to. I looked at them and said one simple thing: now you know why I refused then. Now you understand that you cannot go back to those who did not respect you, you cannot take the mistakes of the past as a chance for the future. They didn't say anything, just shrugged their shoulders. Their eyes were full of disappointment and quiet regret. I realized that they still didn't understand me. They still saw me as an opportunity, not as a person who just wants to have a chance on his own path, regardless of everyone else. I felt that they could not forgive me for that. But at the same time, I felt an inner relief. It was my decision, and I wasn't going to be manipulated anymore. My victory was not in helping them. My victory was not to let them influence me again. I was able to resist. They left my office and never showed up again. I didn't wait for their call anymore because I realized it was just the final act in their drama. I was on my way, and they could not stop me. And although I didn't get the feeling of complete victory, because my family remained an important part of my life, I still realized that sometimes to become strong, you have to give up on people who are not able to respect you for who you really are. And maybe one day I will be able to forgive them. But at that moment, I knew one thing: I did not depend on their permission to be successful. It was just my life, and I was ready to fight for it to the end.